Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this afternoon's Explorance World Spotlight session. My name is Kimberly Archibald, and I am the Consulting Director at Explorance. And I am joined today by a friend, former colleague at Mercer, Sean Connelly, who is the Total Rewards Preference Research Lead at Mercer for US and Canada. Welcome, Sean.
Welcome. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. Do you want to start maybe by just doing a very quick introduction so all of those who are listening in know a little bit about who you are and where you're coming in from?
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing this work for about 30 years, always listening to employees through surveys, focus groups, digital focus groups, really trying to understand what they're thinking and then help companies take that and use that to make good decisions, either how they communicate, how they create plans to respond, but really helping organizations make good decisions by understanding the perspectives of employees.
And thank you so much for spending the time with us this afternoon to talk about a piece of Mercer research that you've been involved in. And certainly, just to give everyone the context for our webinar today, of course, this is a Explorance World Spotlight session. So we're going to be doing a high level sort of sneak peek at Sean's upcoming session at the Explorance World conference next week in Boston. And we'll share more information about that at the end of the session. But I think, Sean, why don't we dive right in and maybe we could start by talking a little bit about the Inside Employee Minds study that the research is really coming from that we're going to be looking at together today.
Sure. Thanks. So this is a study we've done at Mercer over the last several years coming out of the pandemic, where we look to really, as it says, understand what's inside employees' minds. What are they thinking about? And the interesting part of this research, as opposed to our client research, we do a lot of client studies, is we're able to ask things that you probably wouldn't ask in a company's own engagement survey. And we can look across all organizations. So we partner with a firm to get a good sample. We can sample across different industries. You can see this here in the US and Canada. So we have very good confidence. We've got good data to represent US workers, Canadian workers, and these industries. We have a few additional industry cuts, but these are the ones that we specifically sample for. And the one thing I'll say is that's a little bit different here in this spotlight session versus the Explorance session next week is that we're really focused on the U.S. data in that here we've kind of shown some of the distinctions between the U.S. and Canada, which are actually really interesting, I think.
And if I remember, this is research, this is ongoing research. So Mercer conducts this study every couple of years. And can you talk a little bit about some of what you're seeing at a high level, that Canadian and US perspective?
Yeah. So what's interesting, especially when you think about it historically and how things have changed. So the first version of this came about just after the pandemic, so 2021. When we looked at what people were really worried about, people were very worried about well-being, physical well-being, mental well-being. The economics weren't a big part of that. They weren't worried about paying the bills. They weren't as worried about saving for retirement. They weren't worried about their job security. And now, a couple of years later, that is not completely reversed. People still care about their health and well-being, but that has come down quite a bit. And what has come up is issues around starting even in 2023, the issue of covering the monthly bills. So think about what was happening in the news. Inflation shot up. People were really worried about that. And then this year, the biggest movement up was around job security. So as we start to see people losing jobs, you see big layoffs in the news, lots of
Mhm.
technology issues, which we'll get into. People are much more worried. So things do change, and it is interesting that everything that I think that we've seen historically change. You could almost go back to the news and say, "Oh, look, here's what was the national conversation in 2022, 23, 26," and it kind of fits, which actually is nice that it is aligned to some form of reality. So it does change over time.
It is. It's interesting. I mean, we think about we were, back in the sort of pandemic days, and some of the results were more aligned to some of that sort of pandemic reality, and that job security piece I'm hearing from you is going to be one of those big themes that we're going to be talking about as we go through some of this research. And so maybe we can jump ahead and start actually looking at some of these key findings that you're going to be presenting around, where really are those big pressure points and what is on employees' minds about some of this context and some of the different changes and disruption that's happening around us.
Yeah, you made an excellent reference to the word pressure. What is pressuring people? Kind of the overall theme that we have for this is that employees are under pressure. There's lots of pressure, and there's a lot that's coming on inside their environment, but also on the outside. And so one of the things we definitely see is what's happening at the macroeconomic level. So you see this question at the top, am I worried about the economy in my country? Do I think it's, on track? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to stay the same? Uh, Only 25% in Canada say the country's economy is going to change for the better. It's actually, look at it versus the US. 41% in the US
Huge
are saying it's
difference.
going to be better. Huge, huge difference. That was actually a surprise, right? The first time we went through and saw that. A lot of times, historically, we'll see US data and Canadian data being somewhat similar. Maybe there's a couple of points off, but mostly I would say, doing this for 30 years, the normative data I've seen would say that, despite being off a couple of points, the storyline is very similar. That's a very different storyline. There's a lot of anxiety around that. You can see here at the bottom, in both countries, 70% of the workforce said, yes, I'm more stressed about inflation, about market volatility. People are very concerned about tariffs. You can see even more so in Canada than the US. They're worried about how it's going to impact their jobs, over 50%. Here, a little bit more in the US. But there's something going on in Canada. I was talking to a colleague just earlier about why this may be. And we think there's something about people in Canada perhaps paying a little bit more attention. News maybe a little bit more focused on the tariffs and issues with the U.S. But it is quite a big a difference, especially when you think about the disconnect between change for the better and change for the worse. It's not a huge difference here in the US, right? Some people are very, very mixed. So it's only about a 6 point difference, but it's a 15-point spread here in Canada. So really some interesting things going on. People are worried about that. And what happens when people are worried about what's happening in the economy, they start to worry about what's going to happen with my job. Am I going to have a job? And we'll get into some of those concerns later on.
And
But
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and a big thing that we had hinted at before is the technology issues. And we've asked a little bit in the past, but a little bit more so this year. What are people thinking about AI? We have some leadership studies. We have something called the Global Talent Trends. And the massive theme of that is when we talk to senior leadership and investors, we talk to investors for the first time this year, they have incredible expectations for what AI is going to do, right? It's going to solve all world problems. It's going to make everything so much more efficient. And people aren't feeling that quite yet. And we see this kind of mixed level of emotion. So there are, a bunch of people who think maybe it will help me. Maybe it can make me more effective, more efficient, and help me do my job. But you could see, less than a quarter in Canada, just over that in the US, feel like they're actually given the right tools. But there's also a lot of fear. Like half are worried about what is this going to mean for my job. And I think the way we've thought about this disconnect is there's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of expectations. People don't want to be left behind, right? So it's not like they fear it and it's something I have to push off. It's something I want to learn about so I could stay ahead of things, but I'm not there yet. So I think a lot of employees are feeling kind of a little bit caught off guard. How am I going to play in this? How does this, can it help me? Maybe I do a little bit of it, but they're really looking for organizations to guide them on how they could better integrate and utilize AI in their jobs. There's not a whole lot of kind of ostrich put their head in the sand saying, I don't care
Right.
about this. I don't think about it. I can remember the old days. And this shows how long I've been around. I worked with a client and they said, we can't get some of our administrative assistants to get off the typewriters. We're trying to move them to computers, and they say, absolutely not. I'm going to stay in the typewriter. We're not getting that here. People want to see it, they want to utilize it, but they're just really worried about what it's going to mean for them.
And certainly that was one of the things that really struck me in looking at this particular slide for the first time at the how low the percentage is for that first aspect around, do we have access to the AI tools that really will help us live that, story we've been told about, like it's going to be more effective, you're going to do, less of the stuff that could be automated and is, maybe less interesting in your day to day. That those results being so low, and then contrasted with that worry about how the technology is actually going to have impact. There's something interesting about those two aspects when
Yeah.
we bring them together. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about those.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's getting back to what I was saying is like there's kind of enthusiasm for or potential enthusiasm for what it could do for me in my job. Can
Yeah.
it make my job better? Can it make it easier? Can it give me more time to do the things that I want to do? But there's a lot of unknown. I don't know how it's going to affect me. I don't know if it's going to take my job away. I don't know if it's going to completely blow up what I'm doing. And so the less I'm aware of what's out there and have the tools to use it, the less likely I am to feel confident. The one thing we don't have the data here, but when we look at this across industry, it's very interesting. So obviously there's some differences across industry where, for example, tech and financial services, they're a little bit higher on this one on the left here, provided with the sufficient tools. But it's not
Right.
very high. It's not like they're 60, 70, 80% on that. It's still quite low. Retail, food service, healthcare, is a little bit lower, manufacturing a little bit lower than this, but there's not anywhere near the spread that I might have guessed there would be. And so,
Hmm.
and again, part of it may be the expectations that people have, but still people are feeling like I'm not given the right tools, and then therefore I really worry about it. Um, so you're right. It's a very interesting, mixed bag. It's not just a simple story.
Right. And it seems to speak to a little bit of what you were saying at the beginning about, at this particular point in time, we're receiving a lot of messages, depending on the source of some of those messages. There's more or less of this on our minds. And certainly that resonates with me that we're hearing so much about how the AI innovation is going to be this transformative experience. But the day to day, many of us, our day to day work is looking pretty similar to what it was last year. So we're in some of those pre phases, it seems like. And there's more
Yeah,
alignment between the Canadian and US data
there
in this
is.
particular part, which is interesting.
There definitely is here. One of the things that's interesting is if you think about, again, what people might be seeing in the papers and the media. Honestly, 6 months ago, there were all sorts of people out there saying, and it wasn't everybody, but there were all sorts of people saying 70% of jobs, white collar jobs, will disappear in 3 or 4 months. Like there
Yeah.
were, numerous groups that were saying that. Some of them have backed off of that, and I know a lot of organizations have already said like we're slowing down our investments in AI. We've already just read an article where someone had said a couple of organizations have already spent their full yearly AI budget in the first quarter, and so they're going to kind of slow down. So, no question, the world is radically changing in ways that we're just beginning to understand. Um, again, I don't believe that, in 3 months or, next week, 70% of white collar jobs are going away. But I do think that the people who understand what AI is, how to use it, how to make themselves effective utilizing that are going to be in a much better place, much more confident than the people who feel like they're left behind.
Mm. And it's a great call out to all leaders who will be at your session next week, maybe attending the webinar today, just about how there's a sensitivity right now in terms of the employee experience. This is something that employees may feel like they don't have a lot of answers to yet, and they're not sure how it's going to affect them. And so we need to be mindful of that in how we roll out some of these initiatives and really connect with them and make sure that they have some good information related to this.
Yep. All right. Well, when I continue on here,
Sure.
um, one of the things that's interesting is when we start to look at the differences across the countries here and some of these just basic engagement kind of questions.
Yeah.
Um, right. And so, think, am I proud? Am I energized at work, especially? There were some pretty big differences here. Maybe not as big as the 15-point difference that we saw with the earlier question on what the economy is doing. But this is about people in their work. Like the economy, it's tough. People, maybe they don't know what that means. but people have a pretty strong sense of what's happening in their organizations and how they feel about that. And so the Canadian data was much lower than I would have expected. You could see, any one of these things without looking at any individual question, they're like 8, 9, 10 points below, even more than that for this, energized in my work. And so I get it. You might ask, what's driving this? Your guess is as good as mine. Um, in the US, it's actually, some of this has stabilized, some of this has gotten a little bit better over time. We have some theories about that. As people are worried, the more you worry about your job security, the more likely you are to say, oh, maybe where I am isn't so bad. If you think, again, how quickly things have changed, even 2022, we talked about the Great Resignation.
Yes.
Probably, if you talk to 100 people, 60, 70 of them could say, I could probably find another job making a bunch more money pretty easily. I think everyone had that sort of feeling walking around, whether it was true or not, it's a
Yep.
different story. But a lot of people felt that, and there was a lot of job shifting. And I remember being on a call with a bunch of organizations in the retail industry, and they were looking for benchmarking data that was not yearly, but almost monthly or weekly, because they all had some story of something like we were getting hammered with attraction retention. We made a huge change. We did a huge raise for people, so we threw a ton of
Yep.
money at people, and that it kind of fixed it for a little while. And then a month or two later, someone else leapfrogged them. So there was a ton of that, and now there's not as much of that. I think people are kind of looking inward, and so at least in the U.S., which I've been more focused on, some of this has stabilized, even gotten a little bit better over time. But again, I was very surprised to see how much lower the Canadian data was.
Yeah, and to your point, when we look back on the regional benchmarks, so the Mercer sort of average engagement in Canada, average engagement in the US, for my career, we've always talked about those two benchmarks. The percentage might be a little bit different, but
Yeah,
they were usually completely aligned. The trends were mostly the same. The gap wasn't really notable. And so we often would look at things from a North American perspective because from a data perspective, that just made sense. And this doesn't tell that story anymore, this sort
no,
of a snapshot in time. And I remember that great resignation period and lots of discussion around intent to stay and how do we really factor in engagement and real motivation, real desire to stay over the long term when we're as employees constantly being almost bombarded. I remember LinkedIn, you would like be offered money to attend an interview, and like it just felt like you were just constantly being distracted by other opportunities. And I wonder now, in light of what you were talking about, that you know maybe it takes a little bit more to consider leaving because you're so unsure about what's coming and how things are going to change.
that's
Um,
right.
I wonder, so we see this as a snapshot in time. When you think about those regional benchmarks, are you starting to see a reflection of this yet, or are we still seeing that general alignment?
I think we're more seeing the general alignment. I mean, the benchmarks that we use, as you're familiar, they look back, more than a little time. This is interesting because it was a point in time where people
Yeah.
were able to come through with everything that's going on. So I think over time we may see more of this in the benchmarks, but I think at least for this, it's kind of stark, and you'll see it. The other thing I would say, just as you say, we don't see massive differences in the past traditionally between US and Canada.
Yeah.
I haven't seen as big a difference in industry cuts as a lot of clients would expect. Right? A client would
Oh.
say, I'm in this industry X. I don't care about the other industries, and I just need to see this. And often, with little exceptions, um, the difference between, say, a US national norm and financial services or education or pharmaceutical or whatever it is. Maybe manufacturing would be a little bit different. Healthcare would be a little bit different. Even nonprofit was probably the biggest difference. But still, we might get points of 4 or 5, like a 5 point difference from a national norm to a national industry norm would be big. And we saw much bigger differences now. And then I think it's, people talk about the K-shaped economy, how, different people are responding differently. I kind of see the same sort of analogy for industries. What we look at is industries where there's a lot of service, a lot of frontline people, think healthcare, hospitality, food service. Um, their people have not been super worried about their jobs. They're more worried about, finding enough people to fill in those
Mm,
roles. But people are stressed because there's not enough people, so they can't take the vacation they want. They're getting forced overtime. So they're stressed in a very different way than the people in tech, financial services, things like that, where again, they were much more, I think, ambitious a couple of years ago about their opportunities that are out there. And those opportunities are a lot fewer and farther between at this point. So they are much more looking inward, and they're much more, I think, appreciative of what's going on. So we see, massive differences between those industry groupings. That I, doing this for 30 plus years, I've never seen that kind of difference before.
Yeah, like another sort of layer to the disruption, maybe that has an impact on some of this data. I'm interested also in I believe I'm compensated fairly, and I think coming up we're going to start digging into some of that rewards experience as well. But there's that really significant gap, which is notable and surprising.
Yeah, yeah, and then again, I don't have a sense of massively different pay practices
Yeah,
in the U.S. and Canada. Certainly in the U.S., there's a lot of focus on pay transparency, but that's really by state and different areas will have that. I don't know how that works exactly in Canada, but yeah, that's one of the bigger differences here. And so one of the things that we think is interesting is you kind of said this before. What does it all mean for people? So, they're under this pressure. And, we have this experience that we ask in this survey for people to do a kind of complex ranking exercise. We're asking kind of what's most and least important. And what we find is, there's a couple things that people are really worried about. Just the basics of paying the bills, which again, if we looked in 2021, that was not anywhere near the top several, five, six, seven issues that people were worried about. Can I
right.
save enough for retire? So these, core economic financial things, those were not on the radar in 21. They were worried about uh, wellness, work-life balance, things like that. But it wasn't so much that. Now it's, these kind of have flipped. And so what we see here is there's very interesting ranking between US and Canada, which if you look at the top five, there's about 15 things that we look at. The top five are the same top five, but in slightly different orders. So you see the first two are the same. Again, the economic monthly expenses, being able to retire. Well, what's interesting in the US is there's three things that were basically tied. There's a little bit of an order here because it's like, within a very small decimal point difference, but essentially rounding, being able to retire, job security, and workload, work-life balance are essentially the same. So we call them like a three-way tie for second place. But job security was much lower in the last survey. Even in the last survey in 24, it was much lower that people weren't really focused and thinking about that. Now it's come up, and it was absolutely the biggest movement up, in the U.S. Not as big of an issue in Canada, but still the top five.
Yeah.
Wasn't in the top five in the past survey. And then you get this physical health is more important in Canada than what we see in the US. But generally, like these are not so far different, right? Especially given that these three are so close here. So this is one place where, despite everything else that we saw that's different, the things that you kind of personally care about are more aligned. And I think this relates to what's going on in the world, not so much what's happening in my company and my work experience, but these are the issues. Inflation goes up. I worry about how am I paying for the bills today? How am I going to pay for things later on? Um, when that's less of an issue, then other kinds of things can come into play.
Yeah. And just it's such a fundamental aspect of the employee experience that, day-to-day pressure. Am I going to be able to cover those expenses? Am I ever going to be able to retire? Will I still have this job? It kind of feeds into that as well. And again, it sort of speaks to, all of the different things that we as leaders, that we as HR professionals maybe have in mind around what we're trying to implement, how we're trying to have an impact on the employee experience. These are not things that I think are typically something that we'd be factoring in, right? We're thinking about kind of these big programmatic interventions. We're thinking about how do we continue to respond to some of the feedback that we've heard in our different feedback collection mechanisms. But this seems to me more fundamental, even. So our employees, as we go through those activities, we may not be asking specific items digging into those aspects of the employee experience that hasn't it's not typically a part of our sort of core starting point in a standard
Yeah.
questionnaire. But it's number one. So something we need to be bringing in maybe to some of those evolving listening strategies, just around, that basic fundamental where our people are coming in from.
Yeah. And the one thing I'd say about that is uh, in conversations with clients that I've had, a lot of organizations will look and say, well, we pay competitively. We benchmark our pay and
Yeah.
we're competitive. So fine, we're good. And we don't really worry about that, which is kind of dismissing. And not that the answer is you have to pay people more because they're worried about this.
Yep.
We often ask a question in client surveys that says, are you able to deal with a unexpected $400 expense? Right? Your refrigerator breaks, something with a car, whatever that is. Can you come up with
Yep.
that $400? And, there's some organizations where you see, 20, 30% of the people are saying, no, I cannot deal with that. And again, the answer isn't, okay, everyone needs to get more money, but are there ways to better support people in savings, financial well-being, kinds of things? You hear the same thing on healthcare all the time in the US. People say, it's unaffordable. I can't help it. And a lot of organizations will say, but it's competitive. There's a very big difference between kind of competitive in the market versus what does it actually mean for someone. I did a personal, in-person focus group a bunch of years ago, and someone was talking about a health program where they said, I know ours is actually a little bit better than what's out there. But still, if I go to the doctor and I have a high deductible plan and I get $1,000 bill that I've got to come up with, that hurts. That's very difficult for me to deal with. So it just something I hope organizations and HR leaders can kind of understand the distinction between just, hey, we're good because we meet the benchmarks versus what does it actually mean for that employee? And by the way, the last thing I'll say on this, when we look at these covering monthly expenses, that's not just the, driven by the lower income people. Even people up to, 80, $100,000 are putting that as one of their top issues.
Wow. Yeah, and so it speaks to your point there. When I see that, there's a concern around a tendency sometimes to dismiss any of the rewards related results that we see in an engagement survey, for example, coming in from more of those employee experience listening touch points where I think a lot of leaders have opinions about that, whether it's more or less important, whether we already know it's fair, so doesn't matter, that type of a thing. And this seems like you know something more fundamental than that.
Yeah.
And are we factoring in our communication strategies that maybe our employees are feeling uncertain at base, and it's really stressful and it's influencing their perceptions of other aspects of their experience. And you spoke about the pay transparency, so that's a programmatic sort of piece, but bringing that into more of a philosophical, like, are we being brave and having those dialogues with our employees to really dig into, well, what is driving this? What specifically in your experience is causing you um, the most uncertainty and distress? Is it the AI piece and that, innovation and disruption within the market space? Is it something else? So that we can, handle those conversations and handle that data with care and still be thinking in, agile and innovative ways about how can we respond to it. And it's not, to your point, it's not just raises. It's
Yeah.
it seems like a fundamental aspect of the employee experience right now. And it will be so interesting to track over time when Mercer does the follow-up survey, when we see results and we see how this might shift and get even more
Yeah.
insight into what were some of the core things that were really bringing this to the forefront.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, it's all data and insight to help organizations. As I said before, what do I do? Help them make better decisions about how they're going to run their business based on what employees are thinking. So if you know what people are really worried about, at the end of the day, you want someone to be, when they're at work, focused on work. You don't want all this background, am I still going to have a job? Is AI going to take me over?
Yeah.
How can I pay the rent and, cover this and the kid's doctor bill? The more those kind of external issues are brought out, that you don't have to worry about that, the more you can focus in and really do a good job. And I think the value in understanding that. So if there are things that organizations can do to help people budget better, think more about, financial well-being, to understand how they can grow in their jobs, how they can learn new things. That's going to help people, kind of relieve some of those concerns and then focus more on doing what they should be doing.
Yeah. And talk about it. It's one of those aspects that maybe traditionally isn't broadly a part of those dialogues, so maybe we need to bring it in. But I know also that you've done lots of work and Mercer's done lots of reflection on at that, general organizational level. Based on this insight, what are some of the things that organizations should be thinking about in terms of how to, help address some of this feedback if it is in fact a good reflection of what's happening in your organization? So maybe we can talk through some of those recommendations that you've prepared.
Yeah, we can skip ahead. We've got a couple of things that we can talk about.
Oh, sure.
Um, Oops, sorry, here we go. So one thing is just understanding what's going on in your organization, right? So this is a snapshot we do at a point in time. We look across organizations, just as we see differences in US and Canada, and in organizations, we're going to see some differences. So we think, understanding where people are, what their concerns are, on some kind of regular basis. That doesn't mean doing a giant engagement survey a couple of times a year, but have some kind of two-way dialogue that goes back. So you do, kind of understand those things. We think certainly understanding where people are on technology. So we talk about demystifying and closing the technology gap, helping people understand where technology can play a role and support them, where it is something where, maybe it doesn't impact you at all, but helping people kind of understand what is that plan for how technology is going to be used. Because a lot of times, I think what you'll hear from people is they say, there's a lot of talk about it up here at the high level with leadership, but I don't know what that means for me. And that creates anxiety because, does that mean it's taking my job away? Is it going to radically blow up my job? But if they come back and say, okay, here's what this means, here's how we're going to support you along the way in this journey, I think people are going to feel a little bit better about that. Certainly, total rewards transparency. I want to come back a little bit to just a piece of data here that find the right page. Yeah, so we talked about pay transparency. And so we've asked a couple of questions that don't come out with great responses. Um, my manager takes time to explain how my organization determines my compensation. A little bit better in the US, but less than 50% in
That's really
Canada
low.
are feeling that. It's very, very low. And so what happens? People are going through the reaching out. They're looking at Glassdoor and other things. So, 50, 60% are looking at that to try to get information. And the scary thing is 50% of people in the US and Canada are talking to each other. They're sharing their experiences of the pay they're getting. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've seen this as a manager, people don't always share the most accurate information. And so
Yep.
what happens when they're doing that, you as the organization, you lose control of that message. And who knows what goes on when people start saying these things. They could be inaccurate, they could feel bad and say, oh, I got this kind of a raise when I didn't. And you've just completely lost that. So people really are looking for much more information. And as you might guess, with this question at the bottom, there's a tremendous age distinction here. So, 50% is overall. When you look at under 35, it's like 65%. The folks with the gray hair over here, we're much more anxious about that. And, to me, I couldn't imagine doing that. But even people, in their, mid 30s are feeling very comfortable having those conversations because all that, they're just expecting to have so much more transparency around that. They see the data out there and can't imagine why, it isn't just posted on the internet or something like that.
Yeah.
And so whether, that's appropriate or not, sharing everyone's, the idea is that there's very much increased expectations about what this is going to be. So I think organizations really need to think about that. And I think the problem is there are a bunch of HR leaders who are more in that kind of older age range that
Yep.
have a very different view of pay transparency than the young. And I think the more leaders can understand what those expectations are, they can begin to respond to them.
And
So
our
that's
as our work
on
as our workforce, the percentage of the population that's in that younger segment, that's only getting
of
larger and
course, yeah.
larger. So the need to make that shift is all the more important. And we were talking earlier about I'm really concerned whether I can pay my bills. Like it speaks to, that manager result, that really low result around I'm getting good information and I'm having good conversations with my manager about this. There's like a nice intervention point that probably all organizations can think a little bit about.
Yeah.
Because that relationship, I would think if I'm having a lot of stress, if I have concerns, you want managers to feel equipped to have those conversations with their employees, and maybe they're not feeling comfortable with that particular topic
I think you've
right
nailed it on
now.
the head with that. That's what I've seen when we've talked with managers. Managers are kind of this, squeeze point where everyone expects them that information, but they may not have a whole lot more information. And often when we kind of suss out that in managers, they will feel like they are not equipped. They are, we've gone in and done manager focus groups and we'll say, well, what kind of training do you get? What kind of messaging do you get? It's, pay review time. You're going to go out and talk to employees. What kind of messaging do you get? And just very few say they have them. I have experiences where I had an organization that had a very tough year, and the bonuses were less, their raises were less, and they knew it was going to be a big issue. And they actually did a huge change management process. They did training for managers. So the conversation with an employee that used to be maybe 15 minutes was now 45 minutes. And they would talk about here's kind of what happened globally, here's what happened in our business unit, here's what happened in our individual group, and here's what happened to you. And that's how it all went through. In their survey that followed that, perceptions of pay increased. Pay went down,
Ah,
right? Like their increases, I don't say pay, they didn't get pay cuts, but their raises and bonuses were absolutely objectively smaller. No question about that. But the perceptions of pay actually increased because they had this very robust, it was very striking. And I think at the same time, I was working with another client that they had pretty good raises. They had a pretty good year. And people, it actually kind of went down in their engagement survey. And we say, well, what was the conversation? They're like, oh, well, hey, good year, good job. Attaboy, there you go. And that was it. So I've seen in real life, real action, how a very detailed discussion can really be very meaningful. But it takes effort. And
yeah.
you've got to really think about those messages and you've got to spend time training and equipping, just as you said, managers to have those discussions that, as you said, most are not comfortable with. And then maybe that kind of
So
even leads
interesting.
into the well-being aspect, helping people kind of understand because that's still a concern, whether it's physical or mental, emotional well-being. One of the things that's very striking that I've seen over the last couple of years, especially when it comes to social, emotional, mental well-being, there is a tremendous age break, and it's about age 45. If you look at 45 and under, there's a tremendous appreciation, expectation for help and support with those things. Beyond 45, it just tanks. It's much, much lower in terms of people's needs and, or at least stated needs and expectations. I wouldn't suggest they don't need it, but just in terms of their receptivity and openness to that. And you can see it just in terms of the way, even in the high schools, they talk about, well-being and the support for that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
recognition, and I assume that's gone on for a while. So even up to 45, people kind of recognize that. Uh, but again, that's a lot that can go to supporting people. Think about the pressure they're under. And again, we've just been talking about these macroeconomic, all sorts of other things, obviously, that put people under pressure. And so I think much more so than when I was coming through the ranks, people are looking and they're expecting organizations to help support them through some of those tough things in their lives. And then the last thing here, I think this is especially important, and it is, we say, generating excitement for the future. And again, I've seen this play out in organization after organization. The more leaders can articulate a clear vision for what we're doing, like there's a lot going on, obviously, in the economy, in individual organizations, with AI, the wars, right? Lots that are going on. When I've seen organizations say, well, we're not changing very much, and I don't need to say much, engagement starts to go down. People start to wonder. Again, just like with the pay transparency, in a void of information, people are going to create their own story. And you may not like the story that they create.
Yeah.
If you can come back and say, here's what we're doing and why and how we've determined that, again, you could see something where there's a very big difference. Another, quick story of two different organizations that I'd work with at the same time. One was going through just massive changes in their industry, how they responded to that. A new CEO after the old CEO had been there for like 20 years in role, and another organization that was fine. They were stable, not massive changes going on. The first organization's engagement scores improved. The second one went down. And when we talked to them, when we got to leaders, we're like, what's going on? In fact, the first organization that improved, they said, check your data, it must be wrong. We checked, it was not wrong, it was accurate data. But what we learned was their leaders were out talking to people constantly about the strategy and why this strategy is the right strategy, why this other thing that we could have done was not the right strategy for us and their decision making process. And I was very struck by the CEO's words. What he said was, we sold this strategy to our employees the way we would sell it to Wall Street. We sold it to our employees like we would sell it to Wall Street. And when we did follow-up focus groups to talk to people, we didn't even mention this, but they on their own brought that up. And people would say things like, I've never been talked to in that way, kind of treated like an adult in the room. In the
Mm,
past, things have changed, and they said, here's what we're doing, go do it, go execute. And they really made a big effort to kind of bring people, into the fold and kind of go through the thought process. Oh, we considered this and this looked really promising, but here's 5 reasons why that didn't work out. Okay, so we struck that away. Now here's the things that we looked at with this, and this is the data that we looked at. And they got really detailed about that. And people were really inspired. And they said, okay, like I believe this is the right path for us. Now, meanwhile, that second organization, they said, we're not going through that much change. We don't have to make a lot of decisions. The CEO said, I don't have that much to say, so I'm not out there. Engagement went down because people were worried they were not included. So I think to the extent, given all this pressure, that organizations and leaders can come back and say, this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. This is why we think it's going to be a success. That's going to give people the confidence, again, to focus on their jobs and not, worry so much about all these other things. A big part of, am I going to have a job is my company going to be successful,
hmm
right? If we're, not that anything is guaranteed, but if my company is not successful, I'm much more worried about my ability to have a job.
Yeah. And where are we going? Like, what is
And
our
where are we
path?
going?
What's our
Exactly.
path to that success? Which is so interesting, Sean, because when I think back on the last year or so, one of the trends, and we saw this in the Mercer Global Trends report last year, was around results around senior leadership and the really important impact on perceptions of senior leadership and exactly what you're talking about on engagement, whether in a negative or in a positive. And so it was such a hot topic for a little while that over the last year, I've received a lot of questions from clients about, do we have to keep measuring this? Right? Because like we already know. And this recommendation and some of this fresh research really speaks to the importance, in fact, of continuing to really focus on this, but in a purposeful way. Why are we focusing on it? We're focusing on it because this is in part how we can create that container for continuing to generate excitement, continuing to help people feel like there's a lot to be excited for in the midst of
Yeah.
these different pressures. And that when we come out on the other side, there's this, really inspiring direction that we're and this thing that we're building towards together. So when I just think of how often I was getting that question, it's so interesting to see that as a result of the research and one of the recommendations for moving forward.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say about that, just in terms of, the case for doing this, I think, the high level issues are, maybe similar over time. Some of the differences, just like what we saw with, what we saw in 23 versus 26, like things can move pretty quickly as the economy
Yeah.
moves. But the other thing I would say is the segmentation that results. So you could say like, oh, we're doing really well across these things, but are there key areas where we're not doing as well? People are not confident. And the more, especially I do a lot of work in the total reward space. And one of the things that we try to think about is who is your workforce of the future? So when you design your plans, what is your pay, your comp, bonus, maybe equity if you've got that, all sorts of benefits. What is the profile of the kind of person who you need to attract and retain 3 years from now, which may be very different than 3 years ago? And so, when you think about, well, okay, maybe if we're losing a lot of baby boomers and even Gen Xers, if they've peaked in the workforce, there'll be fewer and fewer Gen Xers over time. We look at who are the people who are going to replace them with. What are their needs? Are they very different? Are they looking for things? And guess what? They absolutely are very different. But
Right.
that's true from how I feel about the organization, how I connect with the strategy, how I connect and what I expect from my manager. Understanding those differences and how that changes over time, that's, I think, where the magic is.
Mm, so interesting. Really, really thought-provoking. And we only looked at like 6 slides of the
Just
data,
a few,
so
yeah, it was.
just just fascinating piece of research. Any last sort of closing takeaways? I know you're a person who's been, deep into this study for the last couple of months. Any sort of last tidbit?
Yeah, I think we only looked at 6 pages. There's so much more, that's out here. Hopefully people will come, they'll hear a little bit more detail. This is more fun, it's more of a conversation, but I think we'll get to more detailed information, specific information in the session. But I think the biggest thing is to really look at this, kind of understand where it is overall, and for each organization to say, what does this look like for us? Are our people the same on this? What are the things that we're doing to relieve some of these pressures? What are the things that we're doing to support people where they have these pain points? Um, and what do you know that shows that you're doing this in the right direction and that you have been effective? That's probably where people should be thinking.
Hmm. And it seems to speak to your first recommendation, just the real importance of that continued employee listening, whatever that looks like in your organization, and whatever the touch points are that that you've got in play or that you can manage as an organization. But just how important it is to really be checking in and getting a pulse of where employees are at, and how this is having an impact on them in the
Yeah.
short term. Well, thank you for walking us through that sneak peek. I think if we go just one slide forward, we've got information for everyone about the Explorance world, of course. And Sean, I don't know, I think probably there's an extra slide that you don't have because I was going to do the screen share. Oh, you do have it. Um, Wanted to, of course, continue to invite everyone on the call today to come and see Sean do the more detailed version of this live in Boston. So Sean is going to be presenting on June 18th in the morning at 11 o'clock. So absolutely, if you'd like to join that session, join that day, you're welcome to scan the QR code. All the registration information will be there. There is a one-day pass included through that particular QR code. And just such a big thanks to Sean for taking the time today to have this conversation and have this sneak peek. I know we do have some participants who are still on the line. Certainly, welcome to any questions that you may have for myself or for Sean as you've looked at some of this research and heard some of the insights and some of the recommendations that Sean is bringing forward. So I think we'll hang on the call for just a couple more minutes in case there is anyone who wants to put anything in the Q&A or jump into a conversation. But if not, we'll close it here, and much more to come on June 18th. And so I think we can sign off from here. Sean, thanks so much, and I'll reach out to you and we'll connect next week in person.
All right, so long. Thanks, everyone.